Hi everyone, and thank you and welcome to today's lecture on Art and Opacity by Clare Birchall, who is a senior lecturer in contemporary culture at King's College in London. This is a lecture that is co-produced by Tensta Konsthall and Art Initiative here at the Stockholm School of Economics. And my name is Isaac Nilsson. I am director of Art Initiative, which is an organization for art and humanities here at NCC. And since January this year, we had the rejoice of hosting parts of the larger exhibition Stand the Length of a Miracle by Goldin and Seneby, and that is organized by Tensta Konsthall. And this is a very interesting exhibition that has fueled some very interesting initiatives as well here at the school. Among others, it has been integrated into our education at the master's level, and it has also fueled very interesting research approaches to both education and organizational research. And we're now very happy to take part and develop the public discussion as well around these very highly relevant topics that are inherent in the work by Goldin plus Seneby, such as the demands and the consequences of transparency in society, as well as the rather opaque aspects of the world of finance, which are some of the topics that will be discussed in today's lecture. Before we start, I think Maria would like to say a few words before Claire enters the stage, so to speak, and we will end with a little Q&A. So with these words, thank you very much, Maria, and Tensta Konsthall, and Claire for coming to our school. And then I would like to leave over the word to you, Maria.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. For those of you who are starting to explore the retrospective by Goldin and Seneby, this is one of 6 parts sprawling in the city. A retrospective that is to do with existing work that gets reactivated in contexts where you do not normally encounter art, like the library of the Stockholm School of Economics. And there is also new work, which is a reaction to a short story written by the Swedish author Jonas Hassen Kemiri. And the new works are to be seen at Tensta Konsthall in the shape of a new fashion line, clothes forgotten in dry cleaner stores that have been remade, refitted by Benas Aram, a designer, but also a massive installation with an unforgettably large oak tree in the middle of an art center. I think I have to tell you that it was a big challenge and a big feat that we actually managed to get it there. So some of the lectures and other presentations and seminars that are either part of the retrospective or in other ways relate to the retrospective have taken place literally under this oak tree, which has a number of different resonances in relation to the work of Goldin and Seneby. For those of you who have read the novel Headless, which is a compilation of a number of sequentially written parts over a period of close to 10 years, you remember that there are several links to a famous, although secret society in the 30s called Headless, Acéphale in French, where the philosopher Georges Bataille was seminal, and supposedly this group met under a particular oak tree in the Marly forest. This plays into one of the existing works that you can see at the state finance inspection here in the city center. Headless is also supposedly the name of an existing company, an offshore company in the Bahamas. Just by me introducing these things very briefly, I think gives you an indication of the kind of associations and connections more or less expected that happen not only in that novel but also in the work of Goldin and Seneby overall. And I think this is one of the challenges and one of the assets of the oeuvre, of the production, to constantly be evolving and relating itself to contemporary society, and particularly late capitalism, post-Fordist working conditions, but also magic, as some of the works here also are examples of. So, bringing in you, Clare Birchall, is something that falls very well into place in relation to the work, as Isaac said. But it's also something that me and Simon and Jakob and some other people in Stockholm have discussed over the years. you as one of the foremost representatives of what I have learned in studies. So transparency and secrecy, or transparency and opacity, as terms that often come together and tend to complicate each other. And I think it's extremely interesting to think about opacity in relation to abstraction, which is of course something which is a strong tradition within the history of art and also really present in contemporary art. So I will soon hand over to you, Clare. I want to thank Isak and the others at the Stockholm School of Economics for this great collaboration, and many thanks to the library and the amazing librarian and the team here who have, if you haven't noticed it yet, pulled out a number of books especially pertaining to the works on view with such wonderful care. Thank you so much. So, Clare, the floor is yours.
Hello, yes, thank you Maria for this amazing invitation. Thank you to Golden and Seneby for your wonderful retrospective. Thank you for hosting me here at the School of Economics. And thank you for the team at Tensta Konsthall for all of your fielding of my very prosaic questions. Now I have to say that when the invitation came through to come and speak, I just finished the novel Headless, and if you've read it too, you'll know that academics and writers come to a pretty not very good end in those things. So I was a little bit trepidatious as well as very excited to come here, but I have to say that so far so good, nothing untoward has happened, and I hope that it will all remain as such. Okay, so I think in some ways my presence today here is quite odd. You know, on what authority do I speak here? Standing in this venerable institution of economics, I have to say that I'm not an economist. And asked to speak to the work of Golden and Seneby, I have to admit that I'm neither artist nor art critic. But what I do write about, however, is secrets, and by association, opacity, obfuscation, invisibility, anonymity, privacy, transparency, surveillance, and visibility. So, what I'm going to do in the time that I have today, do we want to turn the lights off a wee bit, or do we decide not to? Okay, it's okay. I don't know if you can see, but if you can, that's great. What I'm going to do today is to take you through some of my ideas about the politics of secrecy and transparency, how they can be applied to an aesthetics of the secret, perhaps in general, and Golden and Seneby's practice in particular. And I'm going to end by discussing their new work installed here at Zero Magic. Okay. So my project, in fact, began some years ago when I started noticing the number of times that transparency was cited as the answer to social and political problems. So the financial crisis, well, we just need more, transparent financial instruments. Global warming, well, we just need to be more transparent regarding carbon emissions. And the most recent case, quite bizarrely, was during the match-fixing scandal of tennis. And Andy Murray called for, yes, you guessed it, we just need more transparency. Not quite sure if that one works. So transparency is the acceptable face of what might actually be wanted or needed: accountability, regulation, trust, and the implementation of unpopular, perhaps long-term decisions in a world of political expediency. So transparency, it seemed to me, is called on because it appears to transcend ideology and political leanings. That is, it is popular across the political spectrum as a rallying call precisely because it belongs to no one. And because it has become synonymous with democracy and decency, nobody can afford to be against transparency. You know, you go to Washington and nobody speaks against transparency in that way. So being against transparency would mean being against progress, knowledge, enlightenment. So hence Barack Obama, his first move on becoming president was a commitment to being the most open and transparent administration in history. Now, I'm not going to talk about the hypocrisy of this moment, although I could for hours. But anyway, let's just put that on hold. Because, you know, Donald Trump also, we should note, is on record calling for more transparency with respect to party fundraising. And this from a man who denies wearing a toupee. So transparency's overwhelmingly positive associations leave little room for secrecy, which gets left to accrue negative associations. So a moral binary has firmly established transparency and secrecy on opposing teams, with transparency collecting accolades and secrecy associated with repression, corruption, malfeasance, and conspiracy. So in my work, I've been applying a more general, politicized ethics to the evaluation of these terms in order to reassess their cultural value. So I've been exploring the problematic aspects of transparency and the positive, progressive side of secrets. I have to say that's one step in a more general deconstruction of the binary, but again, I'm going to have to leave that out today, I think. Now, I think I'm at risk, in a sense, of making it sound like a playful intellectual exercise, but I really hope that it's more than that. I'm really interested in whether it's possible to pass tightly articulated concepts and values in order to see and evaluate them afresh. So my aim was and still is to reassess the political potential of both transparency and secrecy away from their ideological contexts. So beginning with transparency then, I assessed the different ways in which transparency seemed to support a neoliberal settlement. You know, how it could be considered a neoliberal dispositif. This is a term that translates as apparatus, but which for Michel Foucault should be understood as the system of relations between the said and unsaid. So transparency, of course, precedes our late capitalist neoliberal era, but it's articulated and mobilized in such a way that its dominant manifestation is one that supports neoliberalism. If we understand this to mean a system that advocates privatization, deregulation, personal choice and freedom, places faith in the market to govern economic and social life, and provides a mandate to reduce the reach of the state. So modern manifestations of transparency support some aspects of neoliberalism in a number of ways. Now, I'll briefly outline a couple of them here, but I'm not going to have time to go into all of them. So for a start, fiscal transparency is now a necessary condition for the stability of free market economics. To this end, intergovernmental organizations like the IMF, the WTO, and the World Bank require adherence to information disclosure from participating states. So trade agreements and financial aid become dependent upon the timely publication of fiscal reporting, with the intention, of course, of making the world hospitable to liberalize stable transnational flows of capital. And in doing so, a certain normative economic framework is created. So advocated by advanced economies, fiscal transparency is positioned as a universally acknowledged norm, when in practice, of course, norms are always applied inequitably. So the risk here, of course, is that openness might only make structurally inequitable systems work more efficiently, right? Okay, but secondly, I think there's another way in which transparency measures can be read through neoliberalism. So in terms of subjectivity, neoliberalism is often discussed as a set of policies and practices that responsibilize the citizen as the state is shrunk. Now, while this is pitched as a form of empowerment, many have sort of questioned not only what kind of power this bequeaths, but also what new kinds of controls such apparent emancipation might engender. I can't read this, so you're going to have to tell me what it says. But in terms of transparency measures, we can see that open data portals from governments, such as data.gov in the States, data.gov.uk in the UK, and opengov.se here in Sweden, responsibilize citizens to become armchair auditors. The business of monitoring the state falls to the vigilant citizen, the vigilant netizen, we could say. And yet, of course, most of us aren't equipped to read raw data sets. And so the government promotes open data as a new kind of economy, providing entrepreneurs with raw material. And just as neoliberalism places faith in the markets to govern social life, in the case of the data economy, fueled as it is by government open data, faith is placed in the markets to govern citizenship. In other words, it's the market that will decide which data sets will be made available in user-friendly forms in terms of, let's say, apps to purchase. Okay, so the scope of our engagement as citizens, then, is determined by whichever data set can be made to be profitable, whether that's through kind of direct sales or advertising or some other form of funding. So our vigilance has transformed into consumption as we are asked to buy back the data that was first made available to us, for us, now in digestible market form, in order, as one data.gov blog entry puts it, to help citizen consumers facing increasingly complex choices in today's marketplace. Thank you very much. Okay, now there's more that we could say about the relationship between neoliberalism and transparency, but suffice it to say that in essence, my endeavour can be characterised as asking what transparency occludes. In allowing us to see through, as transparency pertains to do, the medium of transparency itself is opaque, so potentially it gives away everything else except itself. So what my work therefore attempted was to consider the medium itself in all its ideological manifestation. Now, after critiquing dominant incarnations of transparency, the question that naturally kind of follows is, well, are there other forms of transparency that would be more resistant to neoliberal formations, more palatable to those of us who feel that good governance might involve more than just revelation, putting more and more out there? And this led me to think about different forms of what we could call radical transparency. So firstly, a kind of hyper-transparency, a transparent transparency. Now, in business schools, I believe, radical transparency refers to an organisation that implements total openness at all levels of operation. But I want to appropriate this term, radical, as one that points to a shift in politics rather than scale. So in doing so, I want radical transparency to have an effect beyond the prescribed role that revolutions usually have within the public sphere. So the mediated nature of revelations and how they are subsumed by communicative capitalism mean that the political system and dominant ideology are left undamaged, and even sometimes renewed through the suggestion that bad elements have been expunged, through revelation and exposés, etc. So in contrast, a more radical revelation, to quote Jeremy Gilbert, quote, has to go beyond the mere telling of secrets and become real acts of what we might call publication or publicity, which involves the politicization of an event or issue, making them objects of debate, discussion, and intervention. So without this, revelations can always be used to bolster the system, and we risk structural repetition under the sign of difference. So one of the possibilities that I explored was whether WikiLeaks could provide a model for such a radical transparency. So WikiLeaks trades in instances of forced rather than voluntary acts of transparency, leaks that place into the public domain data and information that alters the political stakes, reconfigures the parameters of the known and the unknown in ways that have a potential, at least, to prompt change. However, I think WikiLeaks has continuously been framed, and I would argue contained, by Julian Assange's own insistence, albeit for legal and strategic reasons, that WikiLeaks is just a media outlet, right? Because then he can claim that he's an editor or a journalist and he gets the same kinds of protections afforded to those people. So what might be most radical about WikiLeaks is that it reminds us that there are other versions of transparency in which we can invest. So rather than describing what WikiLeaks is, this term radical transparency would have to might instead be a term for something yet to arrive. So radical transparency would have to challenge the ways in which we are positioned and how we understand ourselves to be surveilled data objects. So it would have to perform a mode of revelation not alone aligned with cultural, economic and political forms of neoliberalism for me. It would need to politicize data, transparency and openness in general, to ask, what role should revelation play in democratic representation? In terms of technology, radical transparency might give rise to platforms and programs that can provide more context for open data, stating explicitly the value of open data, to whom and to what it might tell you, or the conditions under which it was collated. The idea that data is raw, of course, is problematic, and so we might have to sort of think about the conditions in which data is collated. It might involve communications technologies that enable large-scale sociability to ensure that transparency is horizontal rather than top-down. That's actually a suggestion made by Felix Stolder. A radical transparency would have its eye on the structural inequalities behind the digital divide and technological literacy, rather than assuming that making data available, just making it open, or transparency in general, is political in and of itself. So that's what I mean by radical transparency, not more of the same transparency, but a substantially different transparency. Okay, but there is, however, another way of approaching the question of the radically transparent for being, if we want to be open about the concept of openness, it might lead us in the opposite direction, towards secrecy rather than transparency. So like transparency, of course, secrecy has particular meanings in contemporary society. The concept today carries with it the negative values it has accrued from Enlightenment logic. It can harbour ignorance, signify malfeasance, and is assumed to be undemocratic. As a political practice, the state legitimises its own use of secrecy, justifying it in terms of national security, but its data surveillance practices revealed by Snowden, things we probably already suspected or knew anyway, but now we have proof for, renders privacy obsolete and citizen forms of secrecy suspicious. So given its bad reputation, what use might secrecy have for the left? So in my work, I argue that rather than call for more and more transparency in fundamentally inequitable organisations, communities interested in a different political formation might want to insist on a right to opacity, a right to have a vision and experience of subjectivity, responsibility, and even liberty beyond the circumscribed transparency of the neoliberal settlement. So this term, a right to opacity, is from the Martinican philosopher Edouard Glissant. So for him, a right to opacity is important for the racialized other. It signifies the right to resist stepping forth into and being rendered transparent by a gaze that constructs the other as an object of knowledge. It means not being available to being understood according to a universalist, dominant Western logic. So Glissant advocates instead a model of relationality that does not rest on the false promise of total understanding and absolute truths. Glissant's secret is an ethical singularity, capable of derailing the impetus behind an identity politics that delimits the conditions of relationality. So opacity, positioned in this way, could be a useful starting point for rethinking the politics of both secrecy and transparency. In Glissant's view, secrecy is that which makes something else possible, a different kind of relation or politics, a different way of assessing relationality or politics altogether. So I've borrowed Glissant's idea from the context of race to the realm of the datafied citizen. Now, given the evidence of ubiquitous data surveillance, how could citizens think a resistant politics through a claim on opacity? Could this opacity recalibrate the system, allowing for spaces of confluence and counter-community beyond the circumscribed position this kind of responsibilized auditor, the entrepreneur, the data entrepreneur perhaps, or the surveilled data subject set out by the neoliberal settlement towards a more radical concept of the commons. So behind this inquiry, and this is probably why I'm most interested in Golden and Seneby's work, was the idea of appropriating secrecy from the securitized state. So in Golden and Seneby's work, it's less the state and more finance capitalism from which they wrest the secret. And I'm interested in those experimenting with the secrecy of the left, those who break monopolies on the secret. So before coming to Golden and Seneby, I want to talk a little bit about my ideas on the aesthetics of the secret, because it's here that we can really begin to see an interruption to debates about secrecy and transparency. This is, of course, Jenny Holz's redaction paintings, one of them. So certainly since the Snowden revelations, but also before, those debates have become stymied, caught up in an age-old, irresolvable question about the balance between state security and individual privacy. We've seen a clear polarization between champions of civil liberties concerned about government's warrantless access to private data and those wishing to defend mass surveillance in a post-9/11 security landscape and era of digital and mobile communication. So to the former, in America particularly, Snowden is a patriotic whistleblower in need of protection. To the latter, he's a traitor who should be punished. In the absence of any final answer to the problem of balancing national security and individual privacy, the political discourse is focused on questions of definition, regulation, and reform. So to take one prominent example, the Obama administration was at great pains to establish a distinction between data and metadata, as though clarifying the NSA's interest in the latter would appease those concerned. The distinction between data and metadata, as well as that, I think there was a similar kind of argument about, American or non-American targets. And this was crucial to the legal question of whether a warrant is or is not needed for monitoring and surveillance. The debate operated then at two levels. So the first level concerned macro-conceptual questions, like this question posed by an opposition between privacy and security. And the second level concerned micro-legal and procedural questions, so such as this between data and metadata. But both make assumptions that are not conducive to the production of the Snowden event into one that could be of use to radical politics. And I'll explain why. So the macro-conceptual opposition between privacy and security positioned the citizen as an individual only in need of collectivity envisaged and imagined by the securitized state. So the individual as a mass can only be thought of as part of a nation in need of protection, okay? But just as limiting, the micro-legal and procedural questions position the problem as one of scope rather than ethics or politics. So for those of us interested in configuring secrets as a properly political subject, it's necessary, I think, to sidestep the debate as constructed by mainstream discourse. And it's perhaps more productive to stay with the secret, interrupting the configuration of the secret as a rhetorical problem subject to legal tweaking or as an entrenched component of the security industrial complex. So if secrets are only left to the securitizing state or passed over in favor of privacy, then I think that the left will have missed an opportunity here. Okay, so certain artworks, I think, help us to stay with the secret. I'm not making a claim for all art here. I saw some quite bad art today, not in the retrospective. And it did not make me want to stay with the secret at all. So certain artworks stay with the secret and interrupt the dominant discourse surrounding secrecy. Now, by asking us to stay with and encounter the secret, rather than positioning it as a problem to be solved through moral discourse, say, or legislation, some artworks move us from a hermeneutics of the secret to an aesthetics of the secret. That is, we shift from a concern with meaning to an affective and distributive register. When knowledge is lacking and cognition interrupted, as it must be in the case of a secret, even an open secret, an aesthetic response or field opens up to us. Now we should note, as Jacques Rancière insists, that this aesthetic turn does not have to involve a retreat from political concerns. So Rancière uses the term aesthetics to refer to the system of a priori forms determining what presents itself to sense experience. It is a delimitation of spaces and times, of the visible and sayable, of the visible and the invisible, of speech and noise, that simultaneously determines the place and the stakes of politics as a form of experience. So if in principle what he calls the sensible is common to all of us, available to all, in practice access is distributed or determined by one's social status and occupation. Aesthetics for Rancière is a distributive regime determining what judgment, action, reaction, and thought is possible in any given situation. Now, though not considered by Rancière, secrets, I think, seem central to these discussions, as in their own way, they operate as regulatory mechanisms that manage aestheta, or perceptible things, people, histories, data, and voices. So to borrow from Rancière's lexicon, we could say that some artworks help us to focus less on a distribution of knowledge and more on a distribution of the sensible. You know, they're less about what do we know, but more about what can we sense and feel and experience. So in the shift from the cognitive towards the aesthetic prompted by certain artworks, and in Rancière's reading of aesthetics as a political and ethical distribution of the sensible, we're offered a very different vantage point from which to consider a contemporary politics of the secret. So to take one example, I'm going to just talk a little bit about the series of photographs by Trevor Paglen entitled Limit Telephotography. Now, much of Paglen's work, if you know it, I'm sure you do, addresses the material shifts that occur not through revelation, but through concealment itself. So Paglen claims that for him, secrecy is not an abstract idea, but a series of physical, legal, social, cultural, economic institutions, and as such, it is made out of the same stuff as the rest of the world. So secrecy, that is, has a materiality. It leaves traces that can consequently become the focus of artistic practice. So the art of Paglen speaks to an aesthetics of the secret by bringing the secret, systems of secrecy, withholding, obfuscation, and opacity into the realm of the sensible, finding what Paglen names indirect ways of seeing and showing the secret and secrecy, let's say in the same way that astronomers have found ways of to see and to show dark matter. He operates in the realm of the open secret. This kind of secret presents a problem to standard assumptions about the cognitive process and template. An open secret requires us to know and not know at the same time. And this chink in the chain of cognition, this acknowledgement of knowledge's fallibility and accommodation of its lack, leaves space that can be filled by the aesthetic. And this is important because it offers different ground from which to view and experience the politics of secrecy to that which has dominated the debate thus far. So for limit telephotography, the spaces Paglen is interested in are classified bases so remote that they cannot be seen by the unaugmented human eye. He tackles the technical difficulty of photographing matter across miles of thick atmosphere by repurposing lenses intended for astrophotography. And they are, as John Beck writes, images of absent content. The results are suggestive and abstract rather than evidential. They appear less like fixed images and more like processes. You know, the interference of dust and heat makes them seem as though they're coming in or out of focus, and they leave the onlooker in a suspended state of curiosity and expectation, perhaps teetering on the edge of fear, disappointment, and frustration. So in aestheticizing the secret, rendering it as a visual, if abstract phenomenon, the photographs of limit telephotography both resist a purely hermeneutic approach to secrets and also distrust the state to have a monopoly over the organization, presentation, and uses of the secret and secrecy. So the politicality of these works is to be found in their aesthetic process and choices, rather than at the evidentiary level. There's not a lot you can do with this photo, even knowing that it's a secret base, right? There's not, what do you do with that? That is to say, they reveal more about the act of looking, our response to, and the limits of open secrets than they do about individual intelligence operations. So Paglin puts secrecy, this is important for me, he puts secrecy rather than privacy in the foreground. And in doing so, he moves us away from the perennial debate between privacy and security, which tends to emphasize individualism rather than collectivity, that arises any time the surveillance powers of the state are revealed. And he forces us to consider the secret on its own terms. It may be, that the most radical response to the Snowden event would be a secrecy to rival that of the state. So we could then turn back to Glisson and his idea about the right to opacity and seek inspiration from it to begin thinking about the kinds of digital technologies that would allow us to remain opaque to the state. Okay, so encrypted email and instant messaging is now widely available. By distributing transactions over several places on the internet, Tor makes it difficult, not impossible, but difficult to identify their source or destination. Tracking blockers like Ghostery intervene in consumer surveillance by alerting users to, and in some cases disabling, cookies, tags, and beacons. Search engines like DuckDuckGo and Startpage allow for online searching without being tracked or profiled. TrackMeNot is a browser extension that floods engines with random search terms to make algorithms ineffective. And we now have access to decentralized servers and clouds, such as the personal server from FreedomBox or the cooperative storage cloud offered by Symform. Very interesting image here. Anyway, we can talk about that later perhaps. So such technologies have been called on before. I'm not the first one to talk about this, but they've been called on before to reinforce privacy. But here I'm suggesting that they can be used in the service of opacity, understood as a refusal to be legible to the state within the parameters and under the apolitical capacities it has allotted us. So contrary to popular thought, a move towards the secret doesn't have to be regressive, totalitarian, or statist. This is not a classic defense of secrecy or the secret to the detriment of personal liberties, which is the way it's most often talked about. So rather, it's a way of thinking the secret and liberty otherwise, as well as sort of recalibrating the political values attached to visibility and opacity. Okay, and this brings me at last to Golden and Seneby's work. So Tim Melley has come up with the term the covert sphere to describe the cultural imaginary created through spy fiction and films. Apart from revelations by whistleblowers like Snowden, such a sphere constitutes the public's only access to the world of covert intelligence operations. So this covert sphere, which represents but is not the same as the covert sector or state, would include Hollywood films like Zero Dark 30, the Bourne Identity movies, the novels of many an ex-CIA agent like Jason Matthews, investigative journalism from the likes of James Reason, Eric Lichtenblau, and Glenn Greenwald, documentaries like those made by Laura Poitras, video games like Call of Duty, TV shows like 24 or Homeland, but also the artworks of Paglen, Jill Magid, Jenny Holzer, Mishka Henna, and others. So financial institutions, I think, could also be described as having a corresponding covert sphere, a discursive and aesthetic space in which the opacity and obfuscation exercised by brokers and traders is challenged. So the covert sphere might constitute films such as the recently released The Big Short, plays like Lucy Prebble's Enron, novels like that of ex-trader Alex Preston, or the US National Public Radio podcast Planet Money, for example. But it would also include works of imaginary economics, as Olav Valthius phrases it, including many of Golden and Seneby's projects collected for this wonderful retrospective. So in their artworks, we encounter both of those forms of radical transparency that I was talking about just now. So first, in terms of this hyper-transparency, as a push for a transparent transparency, a radically contextualized transparency, their work simultaneously decontextualizes and recontextualizes the instruments, strategies, and knowledge of finance capitalism. They not only make the onlooker encounter otherwise abstract practices and forms, including money itself, which could be argued to be the most abstract form of all, but they also encourage critical thought about those practices and forms. This is radical transparency in the sense that it does not just rely on revelation to make a difference, but moves often to intervention. And so, for example, I know this isn't part of the retrospective, but in M&A, mergers and acquisitions, the actors' wages and therefore duration of the performance were dependent upon the solvency of a fund fueled by an algorithm constructed to detect mergers and acquisitions. So the piece demonstrates the dependence of the art world on the world of finance in an undeniable way. So it's not just that art is a market, but also that its very existence today is dependent largely on the kind of money only possible through these forms of speculation. The arts have to accept the market as patron. They live in the shadow of the market. And it also reveals something about the fragility of algorithms that might misinterpret a message about a possible merger, as well as the automation of financial markets that has led to an increase in high-frequency trading and algorithmic governance. So M&A's existence is precarious, as is the labor of the actor, and its fortunes are reliant, as are ours, on seemingly remote post-human financial systems. Similarly, even while the mysteries pile up in Headless, Golden and Seneby offer revealing glimpses of how offshore tax havens operate. The mystery as to whether Bataille secret society, Asafale, lives on as an offshore company, creates readers and onlookers as subjects that want to know. So our curiosity is piqued as much for details about environments of legalized secrecy, as Nuttall and Mbembe term offshore finance, as it is for the knowledge of any conspiracy in the narrative. So the project not only maps out the system of offshoring, but models it too. Golden and Seneby therefore interact and intervene in the very map that they seek to draw in ways that make us see this map anew, so not just from above, but also from the ground. Or to use another analogy, the work operates in a similar way to barium sulfate administered before a CAT scan. It brings to our attention any anomalies in the body or system by being in the body or system. And if we turn to Zero Magic, exhibited here at the School of Economics, we both learn what short selling is and, I haven't seen this, but watch a performative magic trick for the financial market. So Golden and Seneby claim to have infiltrated a hedge fund and recreated its short-selling practices. And in terms of hyper-transparency, even while the references to magic mystify the operation, the work also produces a patent that reveals strategies. And moreover, it confronts the politics of a market that can thrive on failure, and an instrument that can, in its illegal and even quasi-legal manifestations, manipulate the market. So traditional transparency demands in particular countries do actually require firms to report their short positions as a settlement. The quantity of short selling then isn't necessarily secret, but it's not radically transparent either. So in other words, no political context is provided. And even apart from the politics, in terms of whether traditional limited non-radical transparency is useful for traders, it's debatable. So one report that I read puts it thus. It says, it is doubtful that knowledge of the size and change in a short position conveys any useful information unless one is aware why the short position exists, why it has changed, or what related long position may be offsetting it. And the same report suggests that even regulators find the value of short-selling transparency in assisting in combating market abuse is generally limited. So even sort of within the terms set out by the very discourse that creates it, or the very system that creates it, even a limited form of transparency isn't necessarily that helpful. So it sort of recognizes having its limitations. But some of Golden and Seneby's work also speaks to the other trajectory that I imagined for radical transparency, towards secrecy, towards a secrecy of the left. So the strain of hyper-transparency in this work, so more transparent than transparency, ensures that we see financial instruments and worlds anew and experience and participate in those worlds in varying degrees of proximity. It demands that this is a contact zone. I always remember that phrase. So I used to teach American studies, and that's the phrase that's used about the English and Native Americans, contact zone. Okay. Paradoxically, this can involve experiencing the holes, absences, invisibilities, and opacities that are a structural element of the financial system. It brings forth that which holds back. We see that we cannot see, not because of our ignorance anymore. It's not that the financial system is complex. I mean, it is, but it's not just because of that. But because certain kinds of secret allow the system to operate. So like Paglen's work, we have to experience the secret. So Golden and Seneby's pieces contemplate these financial secrets without reverence. Some financial secrets are punctured through the hyper-transparency I've just referred to, unveiling and demystifying the financial world. But crucially, Golden and Seneby also challenge the financial world's monopoly on secrecy by creating rival veils and mysteries. So returning to Headless, we can see that by testing the limits of both revelation and concealment, by populating their world with illusionists, proxies, speculators, actors, and subverters, by creating conspiracies, mysteries, and tricks to match those of the market, Golden and Seneby are key players in the appropriation of the secret. And moreover, they tease out those who hold secrets. So they force them into the semi-sunlight. They goad them, they tempt them, play them. There's KD, right, apparently a real employee of the Sovereign Group, an offshore financial management company, whom Golden and Seneby provocatively allocate as the author of their ghost-written novel, Headless. She's the ghostliest of ghostwriters, authoring the work only in the way that muses do. We could say that she haunts the ghostwriter. So the company is tricked or cornered by Golden and Seneby into communicating with them, and in doing so, unwittingly provide the artist with traction for the narrative and a menacing form of institutional critique. And with Zero Magic, there's the hedge fund in the US whose trading practices Golden and Seneby are trying to patent, forcing the hand of other hedge fund managers. So to challenge the patent, a hedge fund manager will have to admit to already implementing the strategy. And in raising their heads above the parapet in this way, if only for a brief moment, the advantage secrecy affords no longer belongs solely to the hedge fund players in Golden and Seneby's work and game. It's a game, we should not forget, in which the artist's identities remain opaque. in their refusal to occupy the space of the individual star artist, relying instead on collaboration and representatives, they bring new force to anonymity. So as Angus Cameron, an academic collaborator on Headless, points out, there is nothing new about anonymity in art, but anonymity for Golden and Seneby becomes a threshold over which they step forth and retreat again, that creates an instability for the already unstable idea of anonymity. So we could say that they are queering anonymity. Like the signifier 0, the name Golden and Seneby is a holding space. It arrives only to announce a non-arrival. So we should not think of it as a holding space that will one day in the future be filled with plenitude and presence, or that was occupied by a fully self-present identity in the past. You know, 0 is nothing. Golden and Seneby is nothing. And that is why both are able to do the work that they do. There is perhaps something inherently subversive or magic about 0. Brian Rotman writes, by drawing attention to the failure of the anteriority of things, signs in the case of itself, what possible prior thing can it be referring to? 0 demolishes the illusion of anteriority for all numbers. And I would say, as with numbers, so too the artist's name. What prior, fulsome, identifiable thing do these signifiers represent? And we are left then in a kind of semiotic freefall in which all of our usual forms of orientation and cognitive mapping are redundant, an experience perhaps that replicates the freefall of the market during the crash. The title of the work is not just 0, however, right? It's 0 magic. So if magic originates from the Persian magush, meaning to have power, then 0 magic might indicate an absence of power, or the power of absence. The former reminds us of our experiences of powerlessness, but the latter speaks to the political potential of the secret that I'm imagining as an untapped resource for those of us interested in a different politics of transparency and secrecy today. So in 0 Magic and elsewhere, Golden and Seneby's work suggests a helpful challenge to any simple binary opposition between transparency and secrecy. In Headless, 0 Magic and other works, we find a really complex continuum that encompasses the transparent, the not transparent, the not transparent, the secret, and the open secret. And I wouldn't want to necessarily put that all in a line, but yeah. So through this gesture, we see that the transparent can be just as opaque as the secret, and that some secrets are there in plain sight for all to see. So the open secret is a testament to the fact that revelation will not always be enough to do the work that we want it to do. And what is needed is action, politicization, and intervention. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire, for a very interesting lecture. I think we've got some time for a few questions. I bet there are many out there, so are there any that would dare to start? Eric?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for a great lecture. I was thinking of a Swedish philosopher named Torbjörn Tännsjö, who has the quite opposite take on transparency and surveillance. And his argument would be something like that if we were totally surveillanced, things like, and the things that we fear the most would be transparent, like our medical records with mental illnesses, abortions, etc. If they were open, they would be less stigmatized, and it would have a good outcome. I'm just curious, what would your take be on that sort of counter-argument?
I mean, so have you read David Eggers' The Circle? It's a novel, and it's sort of a dystopian novel, and it very much makes that argument that one of the characters, the protagonist May, is very dismayed because her boyfriend captures them having a sexual encounter, and he says, well, it doesn't matter, everybody does it. If we all shared these experiences, there wouldn't be any stigma attached to it. And it's a dystopian novel for a good reason. There's a kind of moment in it where the tyranny of transparency, of that total transparency, becomes the same as a sort of totalitarianism. Like the inability to step back, the inability to not be part of the transparent realm in any way becomes a kind of synonymous with tyranny and totalitarianism. So I think I understand that point, and I think that's why I'm always very careful when I talk about this, because we were talking today, Theo, about the difference between being silenced and retreating and behind opacity, or using opacity, because they're completely different. And I think that if you're being silenced about something which is stigmatized, then that's a very different politics to it than if you wish to disengage from the way that discourse is established in the first place. So it depends on why it's been stigmatized, I suppose. Yeah. But it's an interesting one. Thank you.
Any more? Yeah.
Thanks a lot. It's quite interesting, especially here in this setting, because I think what we are starting is kind of process of having an art criticism from our perspective, in a sense. How do you approach art? How do you understand art? And how do you analyze art? If you want to get some kind of further knowledge about the system we're working. I mean,
So are you speaking from?
I'm speaking about being in a management school,
Okay.
being in school where
Right.
there is a department working on finance, but mind you, management is not identical to finance, and there are oppositions between and resistance, I would even say, between some departments that thinks that finalization is not the final kind of truth. You were talking about politicization, and what do you see the possibilities from actors in the art world and artists to mix into the other world, the world of the model builders? I mean, there was some sort of dichotomizing in your way of putting it, left and liberal. I'm not so sure that these are quite certain kind of positions, if everything else floating. So, but you see? Yes. Where is the limit between mystification, secrecy, and getting into action? How does the art world getting into action in a serious way, and what does that mean?
Yeah, I just, this is a perennial debate about politics and art, and I really couldn't say anything more profound than has already been said by lots of other people. I think I just look for. I mean, I don't just write about art. In fact, I rarely write about art. I'm a cultural theorist, so I'm sort of actually more interested in the spaces where politics arises that is open to the masses. Okay, so actually, it's quite a problematic experience for me to talk about art, because everyone suddenly says, oh, so now you're writing about quite a rarefied space, and I would argue that I just don't see it in that way. I don't see it as compartmentalized, because it seems to me, particularly in this kind of datafied, surveillant moment, that artists are really engaging with that, and particularly digital artists. And I definitely wouldn't think about that as separate, because the way that we encounter digital art is often in mass forms. And I know this isn't quite what you're asking, but I'm not sure that I would separate those things out like that. So politics and culture, because for me, as a cultural studies practitioner, it's always already political. There's no point in thinking about these things as separate. And now I'm thinking about visual culture. It's just another sort of realm for me. But I'd be interested to know about the transparency of the institution in which you work, because these are also political, bureaucratic.
I have a question to pick up on that, because thank you, by the way, Claire, it was wonderful. But I was thinking about, like, as you start to speak in the art world, let's say, and also what I appreciate about your argument also from reading texts of you is also maybe the point of trying to break down the kind of simple binary, let's say, between secrecy and transparency. But I think, and I understand in a kind of wider political context, of course, the strategic move then is to, to look at what are the qualities of secrecy, or how can secrecy be used strategically, let's say. But then what happens when you start to have that discourse within the art world, which at least, let's say, within an institutional, or let's say an art market specifically, where secrecy is such a core and kind of very old, let's say one of the oldest ways of building value, and how kind of artworks build value through often a very romantic understanding of secrecy, and how that's really currency within the art market in a certain way. And that's something I would be interested to hear you reflect on.
I suppose for me that's mystification, fetishization, and you read this piece that I was writing about in terms of aesthetics of the secret, and of course there's an unconditional secret, which I didn't talk about today, which would be nothing to do with, so there's a kind of secret which is nothing to do with that which we could know but we just don't know. And that I think that's where value is generated because of that. I mean, there is an answer to how much something is worth at any given moment. And it can be, it's a market, so it can be affected as to what we think it is or is happening, right?
It was also a not very transparent market. I mean, it's also a case that people who work in finance and also become art collectors are always shocked at the fact that what you can do in the art market would be illegal in the financial markets. And that we work with, for M&A, for example, we work with this investment banker who provided the trading strategy, and he's also on the board of, where he's on the acquisition committee of MoMA. And so we don't, so for a talk that was given in this exhibition, we invited him to come for the talk, and he starts talking about how he developed this trading strategy. And then he goes on to talk about like how he got into art collecting, and how like his friends in trading are like, so is it true you can like scoop up this work for like $10,000 and then you can sell it the next week for $100,000? And as I start to understand the art market, I understand that no, there's just two guys who had a lot of this work, and then they bought it from each other, and they pushed up the value. And now when I'm in the MoMA acquisition committee, I see that I can know about a solo show coming up for an artist at MoMA, and I can scoop up that work as well. And of course, which would be completely illegal in the financial system. So, and also another curiosity that I thought of here is, of course, that as it happens, Trevor Caitlin is one of the favorite artists by this hedge fund that we infiltrated, and they collect his work, and they have supported his work over the years. And I think for them also, this kind of secret publicity of the art world is a very useful function in terms of getting access to people, to a kind of collector clientele, which might also invest in a hedge fund without being in the kind of mainstream public sphere. And so I think there are all those specific complications the more you start to talk in a specific art world context, where I think the kind of strategic use of I mean, talking with art is not I understand, but when you talk in, let's say, the context of an institutionalized art market, then there's a lot of other, I don't know, that's something
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. I guess as you were talking, I was also, I mean, I can't really say any more than what you said about that. It's really fascinating. But I was also thinking about the value of secret. I mean, you're talking about value which is created and through opaque systems. But I'm also thinking about the value of secrets, right? And the kind of social value. But also, I suppose, we can monetize that as well in different ways. I mean, when I teach this course on secrecy at my university, we spend a lot of time thinking about social bonds and the sort of the practical value of secrecy and how it can forge intimacy and solidarity and those kinds of questions too. So it's not just about monetary value. There's also kind of social value to secrecy. Could be another way of thinking about that.
I'd like to return to the beginning of your talk when you outlined the current use of transparency in broad terms. And I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about the emergence of this field of transparency or secrecy studies, and how you read this emergence and formation, and if you have thoughts on where it's heading.
Yeah, I mean, I can only really speak to my encounters with it, because I think that in policy circles, it's probably been around a lot longer. I would say about 10 years or so. But I think in terms of I mean, it's been around a long time. But I mean, in terms of it being really studied and thought about and seriously considered. But in terms of kind of cultural interest in that, I think it's probably a little bit of a less time. And the reason for that, I mean, there's all sorts of really nice infographics about the rise of transparency and how transparency becomes this term that's just, you know, the use of it has gone up exponentially. It was, you know, in the sort of late 20th century, early 21st century, and I think it sort of takes the place of, as I was saying, like difficult political decisions. It's a, you know, it's an easy solution to complex social and political problems, but it's also technically possible. It becomes technologically possible to implement those kinds of structures, transparent structures, in ways that it was more complicated before. So I think there's a kind of convergence of elements which mean that it becomes something taken very seriously about organizational studies. So organizational studies is very interested in transparency, as well as development studies, policy. So it's coming out of a really different disciplinary trajectory than the one that I'm interested in. And of course, for us, we're probably more interested in terms of a post-Enlightenment logic of, you know, what kind of light are we talking about now? Like, because I was talking to somebody about the light of a computer screen. And we were thinking about, so if Brandeis, Louis Brandeis's term, you know, sunshine is the best of disinfectants. Well, we've gone from sunshine to the luminous light of a computer screen. You know, and these are two very different kinds of light, and the source of those lights is very different. And anyway, so then you just start to get into lots of metaphors of light and what you can see by different sources of light, what you can't see. And so I think that's quite a nice way. That hasn't answered your question at all, but it's really exciting, because like transparency studies in some disciplines is quite straight and quite bounded, and then I think if you come at it from a humanities perspective, it just explodes in all sorts of different directions, which is why I began by saying, well, I'm really interested in invisibility and visibility and opacity and, you know, silence, because we can think about audio opacity as well. You know, and I think there's lots of different ways of thinking about this. And again, Theo and I were saying today that the problem with working on secrecy or transparency is it's a never-ending project. And maybe you can say that about everything, but as soon as you start to see things through that lens, it's an impossible book to write, because it is like all of these books together.
As it happens, I curated a project in Vienna last summer entitled Future Light, which somehow was spanning between sunshine and the computer screen, with some trajectories through opacity and so on. But I also think it's interesting to hear you describe this development briefly, because obviously it's very situational at the same time. At the moment, spending some time in Korea working on the Gwangju Biennale, it's clear that what many people are craving is precisely transparency.
Yeah.
And so what we're talking about here is very much to do with a certain part of the world.
Yes. So one experience I had at the first Global Transparency Research conference, I haven't got that quite right, but there was some animosity or resistance to critiquing transparency, obviously, because from a third world perspective or development perspective, you know, some countries can only hope to be as transparent as the UK or America. But then I think you have to be very careful about that, because, you know, you want to resist the idea that the South is always copying or catching up with the West. I think that's a very dangerous notion to have. And I guess I have written a bit about transparency imperialism and talking about these portals, these government portals, and thinking about, because those are being exported around the world, and trying to think about what relationship that then sets up. And my only sort of prescription to countries thinking about implementing these transparency measures is to say, not do we want transparency, because you want transparency, I can see why you need transparency here, but what kind of transparency do you want? Do you want it to be this kind of lip service to transparency, this kind of empty form of transparency, or do you want it to have real traction and do something different from this model, which hasn't worked even in the context in which it's implemented? But also we were saying today, I mean, I know Sweden has a very different feeling, understanding of secrecy, for example, than even the UK or the US. So, you know, we have different histories in terms of those things. And so I would never wish to speak for everybody. And when you talk about the left, you know, what kind of left are we talking about? I'm quite specifically thinking about a problematic in the UK, particularly, and the US at the moment, and I can't really speak to the politics here, although I think there is also a global kind of way of thinking about the multitude as well, which has its uses, but you know, we can argue about that.
Okay, I have another question.
Has been done in the past.
Yeah.
Wrapped it all up so good in the last speech you made. But, well, I was thinking about, you didn't mention the dark net as another of those strategies of resistance to transparency. And are we all migrating to the dark net in the future? I don't know. And then I also wonder if you have any comment on the recent case of Apple and FBI, which is...
Apple and the FBI.
Yeah, and then also if you have any comment on the Epicurus theory of secrecy. Like he, as I understand it, Epicurus thought that secrecy was a prerequisite for friendship, because that is a way to stage a friendship, that is share a secret among you and your friend. And then he said friendship is then also a prerequisite for happiness. So this is a very bold theory he has on secrecy.
Yeah, and there's, you know, Simon's obviously written interesting sociological texts about the importance of secrecy in that way as well. So I think in terms of confidence building and intimacy building, you know, those are very important things. So, you know, I guess that's helpful because it's good to remember that secrecy can be foundational and constitutive, as well as be, you know, it's not just this added on thing. It can be there at the beginning, and it can be generative, right? It can make things happen. So, for example, in terms of development, you know, the ability of a child to be able to keep a secret is a key developmental stage in understanding oneself as separate from one's parents or peers. So there's all sorts of ways we could think about secret as being very central in that way. In terms of the FBI Apple thing, I was really interested. So there was a headline yesterday that Snowden said. He said respectfully, you know, something like respectfully, the idea that the FBI doesn't know how to open an iPhone is bullshit. There's nothing respectful about that comment, but I love the way he says that. Yeah, I'm sure they know how to open life. Anyway, whatever. But the point is, with that, I think, for me, is that Apple or any other business, any other corporation, tech particularly, is not interested in privacy, and it's definitely not interested in opacity. It's only interested in those things in as much as it's interested in its consumer base. And so if our interests happen to align with their business model, fantastic, all the better for it. But to mistake that as some kind of ethical position, I think is not correct. I could be wrong. I can't remember what your first point was.
It was the darknet.
Oh, the dark net. Yeah.
Because that's where the
Yes.
Are we going there?
Okay, if
Well,
there...
it's like guns, right? Sorry. Well, it's like
No.
guns, it depends who's using it. I mean, of course you're going to get paedophiles and drug sellers on the dark net. But it's also a space where, I don't know, Laura Poitras can communicate with people and journalists can communicate, in protective circumstances. So,
Trevor Paglin's most recent project is a Tor server
yes.
in the shape of what looks like a minimalist plexiglass cube. So
It's at Whitechapel now.
maybe
I've
there are
seen
two
it.
different
Yeah,
versions.
it's great.
So
That's right, yeah.
a logical step in relation to what you just described.
Yeah,
about it.
yeah. Nice, thank you.
Do you have any more questions? Okay, fine then. So thank you very much for these very interesting questions. Thank you.